The wind howled like a wounded animal. Snow whipped across the frozen valley, covering everything in a cruel white silence. In the middle of that storm, a lone man pushed forward, his breath heavy, his beard crusted with ice. His name was Elias. Ward, a former soldier, a veteran who had seen war, loss, and betrayal. He thought nothing in life could shake him anymore. But that night, the wilderness had other plans. As he trudged through the snow, Elias paused. His ears caught something faint. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then there it was again. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, a weak, desperate cry. Elias froze, listening harder. "Impossible," he muttered. "Out here." The cries grew louder, sharper, filled with pain and fear. He followed the sound, his boots crunching deep into the snow, until he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Half buried beneath a mound of snow, a small bear cub lay trembling, its tiny body weak, eyes half closed. Elias's heart clenched. The cub was barely alive. But then another cry. He turned his head. Not one cub, not two. One by one, he uncovered them, 6 in total, huddled together, their fur stiff with frost. They were abandoned, starving and freezing to death. For a moment, Elias just stood there, his mind racing. 6 cubs, alone in the wilderness, no mother in sight. He knew enough about bears to understand one thing. If their mother wasn't here. Something terrible had happened. The storm raged around him, snow piling higher. But Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled off his heavy coat, wrapped the cubs against his chest and carried them close to his body heat. But 6 cubs were heavy. His arms trembled as he lifted them all. Still, he pushed forward, his boots sinking with every step, his breath coming in short bursts. What Elias didn't know was that saving these cubs would uncover not just a tragedy of nature, but a betrayal buried deep in the heart of the very town he once called home. As the cubs whimpered against him, Elias whispered, "Oh, you're not dying tonight, not while I'm still breathing." Every step back to his cabin was a battle against the storm. The cold gnawed at him, his body aching. But when he looked at the cubs pressed against his chest, something stirred inside him. Memories of the battlefield, of carrying wounded brothers through gunfire, came rushing back. The weight of the cubs was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the past he carried. Finally, after what felt like endless miles, Elias reached his cabin. He kicked open the door, snow swirling inside, and laid the cubs by the fireplace. Their tiny chests rose and fell unevenly. He quickly stoked the fire, stripped off his frozen coat, and began rubbing life back into their bodies with his hands. Hours passed. Slowly, their shivering eased, their breathing steadied. One cub, braver than the rest, blinked at him and gave a weak, almost grateful squeak. Elias felt his throat tighten. He hadn't cried in years. Not when his best friend died in combat. Not when his wife left, unable to live with the man war had turned him into. But here, in the flickering firelight, with 6 fragile lives depending on him, he felt something. Break open inside, he whispered, "You're safe now, I've got you." But deep down he knew this wasn't over. Finding 6 abandoned cubs wasn't just chance. Something darker had happened in these woods. And Elias was about to discover. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest buried under thick layers of snow. The world looked calm, almost beautiful. But Elias knew the truth. Danger was hidden under that silence. The cubs stirred by the fire. They were weak, but alive. Elias fed them warm goat's milk he had in storage, dripping it carefully into their mouths. Their little paws reached for the bottle, their eyes opening wider with each sip. For the first time in years, Elias smiled. But as the cubs gained strength, his mind filled with questions. Where was their mother? Bears never leave their young unless forced to. And why were they buried beneath snow as if someone had tried to hide them? Elias's instincts, sharpened by years of survival and war, screamed that this was no accident. Something or someone was behind this. He wrapped himself in his coat, strapped his old hunting knife to his belt, and stepped back into the woods. The forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. No bird calls, no tracks except his own from the night before. What Elias would find next would not only shake him, it would make him question the very people he once trusted with his life. He followed the trail back to the spot where he had found the cubs. The snow had shifted, but signs of struggle remained. Broken branches, scattered claw marks, and then boot prints. Elias crouched down, his breath catching. These weren't the prints of hunters passing by. They were deliberate, heavy. Men had been here. His gut twisted. Someone had taken these cubs' mother, and worse, they had tried to bury the evidence. Elias clenched his fists. He had fought wars overseas, but he never thought he'd face betrayal in his own backyard. On his way back, something else caught his eye. Half hidden beneath the snow, a scrap of fabric. He pulled it out, a torn piece of camouflage, military grade. His stomach dropped. He recognized it. It belonged to someone from his past. The cubs cried out in the distance, their small voices carried on the cold wind, and Elias swore under his breath. He wasn't just fighting to keep 6 fragile lives alive anymore. He was fighting against something much larger, something that reached into the very shadows of his own history. He trudged back to the cabin, the piece of fabric clenched in his fist. He knew this was just the beginning, and as he stepped inside, the cubs looked up at him with trusting eyes. Elias whispered, "Whoever did this, they'll regret it." The fire crackled. The cubs huddled closer to each other, and outside, the forest waited, holding its secrets. But Elias had already decided. He would uncover the truth, even if it tore open wounds he had tried to bury long ago. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the faint whimpers of the cubs as they dreamed. Elias sat by the window, staring out into the frozen wilderness, the torn piece of military fabric turning over and over in his rough hands. He recognized the stitching. He recognized the pattern. It wasn't just any fabric. It belonged to a unit he once served with years ago. Men who had been brothers to him in war. But what were they doing here? The question gnawed at him like a wolf at bone. These cubs hadn't been abandoned by chance. Someone had taken their mother. Someone had buried them alive in the snow. And if that fabric meant what Elias thought it did, the people responsible weren't strangers. He looked over at the cubs huddled together, their little eyes opened, blinking, at him with a trust that pierced through his chest. They had no idea of the storm that was coming, the human storm. Elias whispered to himself, "I thought I left war behind. But it seems war has followed me home." He poured himself black coffee, the steam rising into the cold morning air, and sat down at his wooden table. He needed answers. And there was only one place he could start, the nearest town, Cold Pines. But leaving wasn't simple. The cubs were too weak. If he left them alone, they could die before he returned. He couldn't risk it. So Elias did what he had always done as a soldier. He adapted. He rigged his cabin like a fortress. Firewood stacked high. Extra milk bottles lined up. He even moved his old cot near the fireplace so the cubs would never be far from warmth. He whispered to them as he worked, "Don't worry, I'll keep you safe." Before leaving, he placed his hand on the cubs, feeling their tiny heartbeats. It reminded him of the battlefield again, the way he used to check his brothers after a firefight, making sure they were still breathing. That old wound in his chest throbbed, but he pushed it down. By late morning, Elias strapped on his gear and stepped out into the snow. The forest stretched out in eerie silence, and as he made his way down the trail, his mind raced. What Elias didn't know was that by going into Cold Pines, he wasn't just seeking answers. He was stepping back into a world of secrets, betrayal, and a danger far worse than the storm outside. The town looked peaceful as he approached, smoke curling from chimneys, children laughing in the distance. But Elias knew appearances could lie. He walked straight to the bar, the place where men talked more than they should after a few drinks. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the smell of wood smoke and whiskey. Heads turned as Elias entered. The veteran like him, rugged and scarred, always drew attention. But Elias wasn't here for stares, he was here for the truth. At the counter, he ordered a black coffee. The bartender, A gruff man with tired eyes gave him a nod. "Haven't seen you in a while, Ward." "Been busy," Elias replied flatly. "Tell me, any hunters been around lately?" The bartender hesitated. "Plenty of hunters passed through." Elias leaned in, lowering his voice. "Not just any hunters, men who don't belong here, military men." The bartender's face shifted just slightly, enough for Elias to know he'd hit something. Before the man could answer, the door creaked open, and a group of men entered. Their boots thudded heavy on the floor. Their jackets bore the same camouflage pattern as the fabric Elias carried. His blood ran cold. He turned his gaze back to his coffee, forcing himself to stay calm. But inside, his mind was screaming. These men weren't just hunters. They were here for a reason, and Elias had just stumbled back into their world. The bar went silent as the group of men walked in. There were 4 of them, broad-shouldered, hard-eyed, and carrying themselves like soldiers. They scanned the room as if they owned it, their presence heavy enough to make the locals shrink back. Into their seats, Elias recognized 2 of the faces immediately. Memories hit him like a blow to the chest. These weren't strangers. They were men he had served with. One of them, Marcus Kane, locked eyes with him. For a moment, neither moved. Marcus's lips curled into a cold smile. Well, if it isn't Ward," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the bar. "Didn't expect to see you here." Elias's jaw tightened. He hadn't seen Marcus since the war. They had fought side by side, bled together. But time changes men. And something in Marcus's eyes told Elias this man was no longer his brother. "What are you doing here?" Elias asked, his voice low but firm. Marcus chuckled, taking a seat near him. "Just passing through. Hunting trip." Elias's hand clenched around his cup. "Hunting what?" Marcus leaned in close. His breath smelled of whiskey, his words sharp as knives. "You already know." A chill ran down Elias's spine. He thought of the cubs huddled by his fireplace. He thought of their mother, gone without. "A trace. You took her," Elias whispered. Marcus didn't deny it. He smirked. "Big animals fetch big money. You of all people should understand. Survival, Ward. Same as always." The other men laughed quietly as if it were a joke. But Elias's chest burned with rage. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were predators. Elias realized in that moment, saving the cubs wasn't just an act of mercy. It was the beginning of a war. A war against men he once called brothers. He stood up slowly, his eyes locked on Marcus. "Leave these woods, don't come back." Marcus tilted his head, amused. "Or what, you gonna stop us, 1 man against 4? Elias leaned closer, his voice a growl. "If I have to." For a long, tense moment, the bar was silent. Then Marcus laughed, leaned back and waved him off. "Still the same stubborn fool, but careful, Ward. You stick your nose where it doesn't belong, you might just lose it." The men left as quickly as they came, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. Elias sat back down, his pulse still racing. He knew now, without a shred of doubt, that the cubs weren't safe. Not while these men roamed free. He finished his coffee, stood and left the bar. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked back into the wilderness. Each step was heavy with the weight of the past, the weight of betrayal. When he reached his cabin, the cubs rushed to him, their tiny cries filling the air. He knelt, scooping them close, feeling their warmth against his chest. He whispered, "I'll protect you, even if it kills me." The fire roared inside the cabin, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, in the dark forest, the men in camouflage moved like wolves. And Elias knew this was only the beginning. The fire burned low in the cabin, throwing flickering shadows across the walls. Elias sat on the floor with 6 small cubs nestled against him. Their soft breaths, their tiny paws twitching as they dreamed. It should have been peaceful. But his heart was anything but calm. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus's smirk. The laughter of those men still echoed in his skull, cruel and sharp. Once, they had fought together, watched each other's backs. Now, they were killers of mothers, traffickers of life. Elias rubbed his forehead, feeling the old scars under his skin. He had promised the cubs he would protect them, but could one man stand against 4 trained soldiers? The cubs stirred, one of them crawling onto his lap. Elias picked it up, cradling it close. Its fur was warm, its eyes innocent, trusting, and that trust cut him deeper than any blade. He had been betrayed before, by the army, by people he thought cared for him. He couldn't let these creatures suffer the same fate. He whispered, "You've lost your mother, but you won't lose me. Not while I'm still standing." Morning came harsh and bright. The snow outside glistened like glass, beautiful yet unforgiving. Elias fed the cubs carefully, one at a time, watching their tiny bodies gain strength. But with strength came danger. The louder they cried, the more attention they might draw. Elias knew he couldn't hide them forever. The men in camouflage would return. And when they did, they would show no mercy. He needed a plan. He spent the day gathering supplies, reinforcing the cabin, sharpening his old knives, checking his rifle. But even as he worked, doubt gnawed at him. These weren't wild animals anymore. They were his responsibility. Could he keep them safe in a fight? But what Elias didn't know was that the real fight wasn't just outside the cabin walls. It was inside his heart, a battle between the man he used to be and the man he was forced to become. That evening, as the sun dipped below the snowy trees, Elias heard something outside, a crunch of boots. He froze, his rifle in hand. He stepped to the window, heart pounding. Shadows moved between the trees, 3 figures slowly circling his cabin. They had come sooner than he expected. Elias whispered to the cubs, "Stay quiet," though he knew they couldn't understand. His grip tightened on the rifle. He had fought wars on foreign soil, but now the battlefield was his home. The men didn't knock, they didn't call out. They just stood there watching from the tree line, their faces hidden by scarves. The message was clear. "We know you're here. We'll be back." And then they melted into the forest, leaving silence behind. Elias lowered his rifle, sweat dripping down his brow despite the cold. The cubs huddled around his legs, sensing his fear. He looked down at them, his chest tightening. He whispered, "This isn't just about survival anymore, it's about justice." But justice, Elias knew, always came with a cost. Sleep didn't come that night. Elias sat awake, staring at the torn piece of camouflage fabric on the table. The cubs slept in a pile of fur near the fire, their tiny bodies rising and falling. But Elias's mind was back in the desert, years ago, when Marcus had saved his life. It had been a firefight, bullets tearing through the air. Elias was pinned down, bleeding, when Marcus dragged him to safety. They had sworn brotherhood that day, sworn they'd never betray each other. And now, here they were. Marcus killing for money, Elias protecting the innocent. The weight of that betrayal was heavier than the rifle on his lap. By dawn, Elias made his choice. He couldn't face Marcus alone. He needed help. There was one person who might listen, someone who had once cared for him, even when the rest of the world turned away. Her name was Clara, a wildlife researcher who had lived on the edge of cold pines for years. They hadn't spoken in a long time, not since Elias shut himself away from the world. But if anyone could help him keep the cubs alive, it was her. He packed his gear, wrapped the cubs in blankets, and placed them gently in a wooden sled. As he pulled them across the snow, their cries pierced the silence. But Elias pressed on. The journey was long, the cold biting into his skin, but at last a cabin appeared between the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, and outside bird feeders hung from the porch. It was Clara's place. Elias knocked. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door opened, and Clara stood there, her eyes widening in shock. "Elias," she whispered. "What in God's name?" Her gaze dropped to the bundle of fur in the sled. The cubs blinked up at her, squeaking softly. Clara gasped, covering her mouth. 6 cubs. "Elias, where's their mother?" Elias's face hardened. "Gone. Taken." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She knew what that meant. She stepped aside, motioning him in. Quickly, before anyone sees. Inside, Clara's cabin was warm, filled with books, maps, and jars of herbs. She knelt by the cubs, checking them with gentle hands. "They're weak, but alive. You saved them, Elias. Elias shook his head. Not yet. The men who did this, they'll come for them. They already know I have them. Clara froze. A men? Soldiers? Or they used to be. Elias's voice was low, heavy. Marcus Kane. Clara's face paled. Marcus? He's dangerous, Elias. If he's involved, this isn't just poaching. It's bigger, much bigger. Elias met her eyes. That's why I need your help. I can't do this alone. What Elias didn't know was that Clara carried her own secret, one that would not only change the fight ahead, but reveal the full depth of the betrayal waiting for him. Clara stood, her hands trembling. You don't understand. I've seen those men in the forest before. They're not just hunting, they're running something illegal. And if you're right about Marcus... She trailed off, fear flashing across her face. Elias gritted his teeth. Then we stop them. No matter what it takes. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. For the cubs, for justice. As the cubs whimpered softly by the fire, Elias felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But outside, hidden among the trees, a pair of eyes watched from the shadows. One of Marcus's men had followed Elias. And now, the secret was out. The night around Clara's cabin was unnervingly still. Snow blanketed the forest, muffling every sound, but Elias's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Years in war had sharpened his senses. He knew when he was being watched. He sat by the window, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the tree line. The cubs were asleep near the fireplace, their soft whimpers blending with the crackle of wood. Clara moved quietly behind him, preparing food, but even she could feel the tension. What is it? She asked softly. Elias didn't look at her. We're not alone. And then it came, the faint snap of a branch outside. Elias's eyes narrowed. He stood motioning Clara to stay quiet and stepped onto the porch. The icy air hit his face, his breath steaming in the moonlight. For a moment, silence. Then movement, a shadow shifting between the trees. Elias raised his rifle. Show yourself. He barked. The figure froze, then bolted. Elias fired a warning shot into the snow, the crack echoing through the forest. The figure stumbled, then disappeared into the dark. Elias cursed under his breath. Whoever it was, they hadn't come by. Accident. Marcus's men knew exactly where he was now. Back inside, Clara's face was pale. They followed you here. Elias nodded grimly. Which means we don't have much time. The cubs stirred at the sound of his voice, crawling toward him, their tiny cries filling the room. Elias knelt, placing his hand gently on their fur. He had saved these cubs from the storm, but now he realized the real storm was human, and it was closing in fast. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. Elias, listen. We can't fight them head on, not just the two of us. If Marcus is running something bigger, he'll have men, weapons, connections. We need proof. If we can expose them, the law will have no choice but to act. Elias shook his head. You think the law cares about these woods? They'll call it hunting. They'll turn a blind eye. No, Clara, if we want to save these cubs, we do it ourselves. Clara searched his face, seeing the stubborn soldier she remembered from years ago. And what then? You can't fight a war alone anymore. You'll die, Elias. He met her eyes, his voice low. Then I'll die protecting them. Better that than doing nothing. The fire crackled, shadows flickering on the walls. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The enemy was out there, waiting. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before they struck. That night he didn't sleep. He sat with his rifle staring into the darkness, listening for every sound. Memories of the battlefield returned. Nights spent waiting for ambushes. Nights where the silence before gunfire was worse than the fight itself. The difference now was that he wasn't protecting soldiers. He was protecting 6 fragile lives, who had no idea of the danger, and somehow that made the weight heavier than anything he had carried in war. Dawn broke with a pale light. Clara brewed coffee, her hands shaking slightly. Elias stood on the porch scanning the tree line. He didn't like the quiet. Quiet meant preparation. By midday, his fears came true. It started with a whistle, Sharp, short. Elias's muscles tensed. He recognized it. It was the same signal they had used in combat. Seconds later, a gunshot rang out, splintering wood from the cabin wall. Clara screamed, ducking down. The cubs cried out, terrified. Elias moved fast. "Get them to the cellar," he shouted. Clara scooped the cubs into a basket, rushing toward the trapdoor beneath the rug. Elias fired back through the window, forcing the attackers to take cover. Snow sprayed up as bullets hit the ground around the cabin. Elias could see them now, two of Marcus's men, circling like wolves. They weren't trying to kill him yet. They were testing him, playing with him. He fired again, aiming close enough to send them scrambling. "Not on my watch," he growled. Clara returned, breathless. "They're safe downstairs." Elias nodded, his eyes never leaving the trees. "Good. Stay down with them. No matter what happens." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you to fight alone." Before Elias could argue, another shot whistled past, shattering a jar on the shelf. Elias grabbed Clara, pulling her down just as glass rained around them. The smell of gunpowder filled the cabin, mixing with smoke from the fire. Elias's heart pounded. It was war all over again. But this wasn't a battlefield halfway across the world. This was his home. And this time, the lives at stake weren't soldiers. They were innocent cubs who couldn't fight back. Elias crawled to the door, peeking out. The men had retreated deeper into the trees, but he knew they weren't gone. They were regrouping, testing his defenses. Next time, they wouldn't just fire warning shots. He turned to Clara. "They'll be back, stronger." Clara's face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "Then we need to be ready. Elias, I have something I haven't told anyone." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Now's the time." Clara took a deep breath. "Before I came here, I was working with a wildlife protection group. We were tracking poachers, big operations, international networks. And Marcus's name, it's come up before." Elias's blood ran cold. "You knew?" "I didn't know it was him," Clara said quickly. "Not until now. Elias, if we can prove he's here, prove what he's doing, we can bring down the entire network." Elias stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about 6 cubs anymore. It was bigger, much bigger. He clenched his fists. "Then we'll get the proof. And when we do, Marcus won't be able to hide behind money or lies." Outside, the forest was silent again. But Elias knew silence was never safety. It was a warning. He checked his rifle, his knives, his traps. Every movement was careful, practiced. He was preparing for war, the same way he had years ago. But this time the stakes were different. This time it wasn't about orders or governments. It was about 6 cubs who had no one else. That night, as the cubs whimpered in the cellar and the fire flickered low, Elias whispered to himself, "You want a fight, Marcus? You'll get one." And somewhere in the dark forest, Marcus himself stood watching, a cruel smile on his lips. "This is just the beginning," he muttered. The forest lay under a cold silence the next morning. Fresh snow had fallen, smoothing over the chaos of the gunfight, covering the bullet holes and broken branches as if nothing had happened. But Elias knew better. Violence always left a mark, even if you couldn't see it. He stood outside Clara's cabin, rifle slung across his shoulder, eyes scanning the trees. Somewhere out there, Marcus's men were waiting. They hadn't retreated. They were circling like wolves, preparing for the final strike. Behind him, Clara emerged, bundled in a heavy coat. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "Couldn't. Not with them out there." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "Elias, what if they come back today?" He looked at her, his jaw set. "Then, today is the day we stop running." The cubs whimpered from inside, their tiny voices carrying through the open door. Elias felt the sound hit him deep in his chest. He had promised them safety. He had promised them life, and he wouldn't let Marcus take that away. But Elias didn't. Know that the fight ahead would not only test his strength, it would force him to face the deepest betrayal of all. He spent the morning setting traps around the cabin, wire snares hidden under snow, sharp stakes positioned at choke points, noise alarms strung between trees with empty cans and bells. Clara helped, her hands trembling but steady enough to follow his lead. This isn't just about keeping them out, Elias said. It's about sending a message. They step 1 foot closer and they'll know I'm ready. By midday, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, only silence. Elias crouched by the window, scanning the tree line. And then, movement. 3 figures approached, rifles in hand, their camouflage blending with the trees. Marcus wasn't with them. Not yet. These were scouts. Elias held his breath as they moved closer, their boots crunching softly on snow. One of them stepped right into a hidden snare. The wire snapped tight, yanking him into the air. He cried out, flailing upside down as his rifle fell into the snow. The others cursed, rushing forward, only to trigger Elias's second trap. A log swung down from the trees, knocking one to the ground with a heavy thud. The third man froze, realizing too late what kind of battlefield he had walked into. Elias stepped out of the cabin, rifle raised. "Drop it!" The third man hesitated, then slowly lowered his weapon. The one on the ground groaned, clutching his ribs. The one hanging, upside down, thrashed helplessly. Elias's voice was cold, sharp. "Go back to Marcus, tell him this isn't his land. Tell him the next time he sends men here, they won't be walking away." The man nodded quickly, eyes wide with fear. Elias cut the snare, dropping the upside-down soldier into the snow. He tossed the other's rifle away, then stepped back. "Toward the cabin." "Go," he barked. The 3 men stumbled into the trees, vanishing into the cold shadows. Elias lowered his rifle, his breath heavy. The cubs cried out inside, frightened by the noise. Clara rushed out, her face pale. "You could have killed them," she whispered. "I should have," Elias muttered. "But I want Marcus to know this isn't fear he's dealing with. It's war." The forest held its silence after the skirmish, but Elias knew it wouldn't last. Marcus would come himself now. That evening, Clara prepared food for the cubs, while Elias sat sharpening his knife. The sound of metal scraping on stone filled the cabin, a rhythm that steadied his racing thoughts. Clara finally broke the silence. "Elias, what if you're wrong? What if Marcus isn't the man you used to know?" Elias froze. "I know him. I saw it in his eyes. He's changed." Clara sighed. "People can change for the better too." Elias shook his head, his voice bitter. "Not Marcus, not anymore. He used to fight for brothers, for honor. Now he fights for money." The cubs whimpered at her feet, climbing over each other to reach the milk she poured into bottles. For a moment, the scene almost looked normal, like a family gathered for dinner. But Elias knew better. Peace was fragile. It wouldn't last. Just as he thought it, a knock rattled the door. Elias leapt to his feet, rifle raised. Clara froze, clutching a bottle. The cubs went silent. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. Elias moved to the door, every muscle tight. He opened it a crack, and his breath caught. Marcus stood there. Snow clung to his beard, his eyes sharp, his smile colder than the night air. "Evening, Ward," Marcus said calmly. "We need to talk." Elias stepped outside, shutting the door. Behind him, the 2 men faced each other in the snow, silence heavy between them. "You've got something that belongs to me," Marcus said finally. Elias's jaw tightened. "Those cubs don't belong to anyone, not you, not me," Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "Always the righteous one, but let's not pretend. You think I'm the bad guy. We both know the world doesn't care about innocence. Out there, it's eat or be eaten. I just learned how to eat first," Elias glared. "You took their mother." Marcus didn't deny it. "A big payday. You wouldn't believe what these animals fetch overseas. One mother bear can change a man's fortune." Elias's blood boiled. "And what about the cubs? You buried them alive." Marcus shrugged. "Collateral. Weak lives don't matter. You of all people should understand." In that moment, Elias realized the betrayal cut deeper than money. Marcus wasn't just selling animals, he was selling his soul. Elias raised his rifle slightly. "You've crossed a line, Marcus." Marcus smirked. "So what now? You gonna shoot me? You think that makes you different from me?" Elias's finger hovered on the trigger, rage surging in his veins. But deep down he knew Marcus was baiting him. Killing him here now would only make things worse. He lowered the rifle slowly. "Leave. Don't come back." Marcus's smile widened. "Oh, I'll be back. And when I am, those cubs won't be breathing. Neither will you." He turned, disappearing into the dark forest, his laughter echoing through the trees. Elias stood frozen, his breath shaking, his heart pounding. For years, Marcus had been his brother. Now, he was his enemy. Inside, Clara touched his arm, her voice trembling. "Elias, what are we going to do?" Elias stared into the darkness where Marcus had vanished. His voice was cold, steady. "We end this, one way or another." The forest never truly slept. Even at night, Elias could feel its pulse, the faint whisper of branches swaying, the muffled crunch of hidden creatures moving under snow, the eerie silence that came before a storm. But tonight, that silence wasn't natural. It was heavy, watching, waiting. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, but it did little to drive away the tension. Elias sat near the door, rifle across his lap, eyes unblinking. Clara tried to sleep on the cot, but every time the wind rattled the shutters, she jolted awake. The cubs huddled together, their tiny bodies pressed into the warmth of a blanket Clara had stitched from scraps. Elias's thoughts were relentless. Marcus's words echoed in his head. "When I come back, none of them will be breathing." Elias had faced death before. He had seen it on battlefields, in deserts, in jungles where men bled into the dirt. But this was different. This wasn't war for country. This was personal, and in that fragile silence, Elias realized something chilling. Marcus didn't just want the cubs. He wanted to break Elias. The night dragged on, hour by hour. Just as Elias's eyelids began to grow heavy, a sound snapped. Him awake, a crunch outside, slow, deliberate. Elias lifted his rifle, signaling Clara with a finger to her lips. She froze, clutching the cubs closer. Another crunch, then another. Elias crept to the window and peered out. For a moment he saw nothing, only snow and trees. Then, movement, a shadow slipping between trunks. His gut tightened. They were here. Suddenly, a loud crash rattled the side of the cabin. The cubs yelped. Clara gasped. Elias moved fast, motioning, her toward the corner. The door shuddered under a heavy kick, once, twice. Then silence. Elias pressed his back against the wall, rifle ready. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. A voice called through the door, low and mocking. "Ward, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Hand them over, and maybe you walk away." "Marcus." Elias gritted his teeth, his voice steady but cold. "You'll get them over my dead body." Marcus chuckled. "That can be arranged." But what Elias didn't know, Marcus hadn't come alone, and what was waiting outside wasn't just a fight. It was a siege. The next instant, glass shattered. A rock hurled through the side window, scattering shards across the floor. Clara screamed, ducking low with the cubs. Elias raised his rifle and fired into the night. A sharp cry rang out. One man down, but more shadows rushed forward, their boots pounding the snow. The cabin walls shook as fists and rifle butts slammed against them. "Stay down," Elias barked, his eyes never leaving the door. Another crash. The hinges groaned. The wood splintered. Elias knew it wouldn't hold. He fired again, each shot cracking like thunder, but for every man that fell, two more seemed to take his place. Marcus's army wasn't backing down. The cabin was no longer a home, it was a cage, and the wolves were closing in. The door burst open. Wood splintered as a flood of men surged inside, rifles gleaming, faces masked with fury. Elias fired point blank, dropping the first one, then swung the butt of his rifle into another's jaw. Blood sprayed across the floorboards. Clara screamed, shielding the cubs in the corner. The air filled with chaos, gunfire, shouts, the whimpering, cries of the cubs. Elias fought like a storm, every muscle fueled by rage and desperation, but there were too many. Hands grabbed at his arms, fists struck his ribs, boots slammed into his legs. Still, he refused to fall. Because this wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for his soul. One man lunged toward Clara. Elias's eyes snapped to him. With a roar, he broke free of the grip holding him, drove his knife into the man's chest and shoved him to the ground. Clara gasped, clutching the cubs tighter. But in that moment of distraction, a rifle butt cracked against Elias's skull. He staggered, blood trickling down his temple. The room swirled, his vision blurred, yet he stood tall, teeth bared, refusing to yield. Marcus stepped into the doorway at last, calm amidst the storm. His eyes scanned the chaos with satisfaction. Well, Marcus drawled. The great soldier reduced to a cornered animal. Elias spat blood into the snow at his feet. Come closer and find out what kind of animal I am. Marcus smirked. Still brave, still stubborn. But bravery doesn't win wars, Ward, numbers do. He raised a hand and his men froze, holding their weapons ready. Hand them over, Marcus said. The cubs, this ends now. Elias swayed slightly, his head pounding. He glanced at Clara, her wide, terrified eyes, the cubs crying in her arms. He felt the weight of every life in that room pressing onto his shoulders. Slowly, he lowered his rifle. Clara's voice broke in panic. Elias, no! But Elias wasn't surrendering. His hand slipped to his belt, fingers curling around. A small object he hadn't used in years. A grenade. Marcus's eyes widened as Elias pulled the pin with his teeth. You take one step closer, Elias growled, his voice trembling with fury, and we all go together. The cabin went dead silent. Marcus's men shifted nervously, their confidence faltering. Marcus studied Elias, his smirk fading. You wouldn't. Elias's eyes burned like fire. Try me. For the first time, Marcus saw not just a man protecting cubs, but a soldier ready to burn everything to ash. Seconds dragged on like hours. The grenade hummed in Elias's hand, a promise of destruction. Finally, Marcus raised his hand again. His men hesitated, then slowly stepped back, retreating toward the door. Marcus's gaze lingered on Elias, cold and venomous. This isn't over, he said quietly. Next time I won't leave you standing. Then he turned, disappearing into the snowy night with his men. The door creaked in the wind, the cabin a wreck of broken wood and shattered glass. Elias stood trembling, the grenade still in his hand, his chest heaving. Finally, he slid the pin back into place and dropped to his knees. The cubs rushed toward him, whimpering, pressing against his bloodied arms. Clara knelt beside him, tears streaking her face. You saved us, she whispered. Elias stared at the floor, his voice low. No, I only bought us time. The cabin smelled of smoke and blood. Broken glass glittered on the floor like shards of ice, and every shadow seemed to hold Marcus's laughter. Elias sat against the wall, his head throbbing where the rifle butt had struck. Clara tended his wound with trembling hands, her eyes still wet with fear. The cubs nestled against Elias's legs, their tiny bodies shaking. They didn't understand what had happened, only that danger had come for them, and Elias had fought like a beast to keep them alive. But he knew this wasn't the end. Marcus had retreated not out of fear, but out of calculation. He would come back, stronger, smarter. And when he did, Elias feared the snow would no longer be white, it would be red. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the eerie creak of trees swaying under heavy frost. Elias's instincts screamed that the night wasn't over. Clara touched his arm. You can't keep fighting like this. They'll kill you. Elias looked at her, his eyes hollow. Then I'll die standing, but I won't let them take the cubs. Clara's lips trembled. Why, Elias? Why risk everything for them? They're just animals. He went silent for a long time. Then his voice came low, broken. Because I've already buried too much innocence. In war, I watch children die in villages no one remembers. I promised myself if I ever had the chance to protect something pure, I wouldn't fail again. The words hit Clara like a blade to the heart. She finally understood. Elias wasn't just fighting Marcus. He was fighting his own ghosts. Suddenly, a sharp smell cut through the air. Smoke. Elias's eyes snapped toward the window. A faint orange glow flickered outside. His stomach sank. "Fire," he whispered. He bolted to the door and threw it open. The night exploded in flames. Marcus's men had set the surrounding trees ablaze, creating a ring of fire around the cabin. The flames climbed higher, crackling, spitting embers into the night. Heat pressed against Elias's skin as he realized the truth. Marcus wasn't just trying to scare them, he was trying to burn them alive. Clara screamed, pulling the cubs. Close, the cabin's wooden walls began to smoke, the heat intensifying by the second. Elias grabbed her shoulders. "We have to move, now!" "But where?" she cried. "Through the fire. It's our only chance." What lay beyond that fire wasn't just survival. It was a trap Marcus had been waiting for all along. Elias wrapped the cubs in blankets, shielding them as best he could. He tore a wet cloth from a bucket and tied it around Clara's mouth. Then he drenched another and covered his own face. "Stay low. Follow me," he ordered. They crawled through the smoke, coughing, eyes stinging. The fire roared louder, collapsing, part of the roof behind them. Sparks rained down, searing Elias's jacket. He kicked open the back door and plunged into the inferno. Flames licked at their legs, but Elias charged forward, clutching 2 cubs in his arms while Clara carried the rest. The world blurred into smoke and fire, until finally they stumbled into the open snow beyond the burning trees. Elias collapsed, to his knees, coughing violently, the cubs crying in his arms. Clara fell beside him, gasping for air, but relief didn't last long. Shadows moved in the smoke, figures, rifles glinting, Marcus's men, and from the haze, Marcus himself stepped forward, clapping slowly, his smile cruel. "You ran right into it," he said softly. "Just like I knew you would." The firelight painted Marcus's face in flickering orange, his shadow stretching long and monstrous across the snow. Behind him, 6 men fanned out, rifles leveled at Elias and Clara. Elias rose slowly, setting the cubs down behind him. His body trembled from exhaustion. Smoke stung his eyes and blood dripped from his temple, but his spirit hadn't cracked. "Let them go, Marcus," he rasped. "This isn't about them, it's about you and me." Marcus smirked, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you? This was always about them. Those cubs are worth more alive than you'll ever be. And you're just a broken soldier clinging to ghosts." Elias clenched his fists. "I don't care about worth. They're not currency, they're life." Marcus's smile faded, his eyes hardening. "Life doesn't mean anything unless someone pays for it. That's the truth you never learned. And..." In that moment, Elias realized Marcus wasn't just a man who had lost his way. He was a man who had sold his soul and wanted Elias to do the same. One of Marcus's men stepped closer, reaching for the cubs. A growl tore from Elias's throat as he lunged, tackling the man to the snow. They struggled, fists flying, boots kicking. Elias slammed the man's head against the ice until he went limp. Gunshots split the air. Clara screamed, ducking low. With the cubs, Elias rolled to his feet, grabbing the fallen rifle. He fired wildly, forcing Marcus's men back into the smoke. One collapsed, clutching his chest. Another cried out, dropping his weapon. The battlefield erupted into chaos, fire, roaring behind them, bullets cutting through smoke, the cubs whimpering in terror. Elias fought like a man possessed, every strike fueled by rage and desperation. Marcus stepped calmly through the carnage, his pistol steady, his eyes locked on Elias. "You can't win, brother," Marcus called. "Not this time," Elias raised, his rifle, his chest heaving. "I don't need to win, I just need to make sure you lose." They stared across the flames, 2 men once bound by loyalty, now divided by betrayal. Marcus smirked, lifting his pistol. "Then let's finish this." And as the smoke swirled around them, Elias knew the next shot fired would decide not just their lives, but the fate of the cubs who clung to his promise. The standoff hung heavy in the air. Clara clutched the cubs, her whispered prayers lost in the roar of fire. The snow beneath their feet was no longer pure, it was trampled, bloodied, and waiting to claim more. Elias's finger hovered on the trigger, his vision narrowed. He could hear his heartbeat, feel every scar of his past pressing on his chest. This was it. The hunter's circle had closed, and only one of them would walk out alive. The fire raged higher, throwing sparks into the black sky. Smoke curled like snakes through the trees, and the snow was no longer white. It was streaked with ash and blood. Elias and Marcus stood locked in place, rifles raised, their eyes never leaving each other. For a moment the world seemed to fall away. No men, no cubs, no Clara. Just two brothers, their past and present, colliding in the silence between breaths. Elias's voice broke the stillness. "Do you even remember Afghanistan? The night we swore we'd never leave each other behind?" Marcus smirked, though his eyes flickered. "I remember. I also remember watching men die for nothing. Promises don't feed you, Ward. Money does." Elias's grip tightened on his rifle. "You traded honor for greed. You buried kids under snow like they were garbage. That's not survival, that's evil." Marcus's jaw clenched. His finger curled tighter on the trigger. "Don't pretend you're pure. You killed same as me." "I killed to protect," Elias snapped. "You killed to profit." The standoff cracked as Marcus fired first. The bullet tore past Elias's shoulder, splintering a tree. Elias dove, rolling into cover behind a fallen log. He returned fire, forcing Marcus to retreat into the smoke. Gunshots echoed through the trees, flashing like lightning against the fire's glow. Clara crouched low in the snow, shielding the cubs as bullets whistled overhead. Her eyes darted toward Elias, her voice a desperate whisper. "Please, don't die out here." Elias reloaded, his hands shaking. His chest burned, not just from smoke but from memory. Every laugh he'd once shared with Marcus now twisted into betrayal. From the shadows, Marcus called out, mocking, "You can't protect them forever, Ward. They'll die like everything." "Else you touch," Elias roared in fury and charged forward. The two collided in the snow, rifles clattering aside. Fists flew, punches landing with bone-cracking force. Marcus slammed Elias into the ground, his hands squeezing Elias's throat. Elias gasped, clawing at his grip, his vision blurring. He reached for his knife, driving it upward. Marcus barely deflected it, the blade grazing his arm. Blood spilled into the snow. Marcus grinned through gritted teeth. "You've still got fight. I almost respect it." Elias shoved with every ounce of strength, reversing their positions. He straddled Marcus, fist pounding into his face again and again, until blood poured from his nose. For a split second, Elias lifted his knife, ready to end it. But then he froze. Because killing Marcus wasn't just revenge. It was killing the last piece of the man he once called brother. That hesitation cost him. Marcus kneed Elias hard, throwing him off. They scrambled for their weapons, snow scattering under frantic hands. The cubs cried out. Clara screamed Elias's name. Both men grabbed rifles, whirling to aim. The forest held its breath. Two brothers, one shot away from ending everything. The trigger pulled. A deafening crack split the air. Elias flinched, bracing for pain. But it wasn't his blood that hit the snow. One of Marcus's men, hidden in the smoke, had fired at Clara. The bullet tore past her shoulder, grazing her arm. She cried out, collapsing into the snow with the cubs huddling around her. Elias's heart shattered. "Clara!" He fired blindly toward the shadows, dropping the gunman with a single shot. Then he turned back, rage igniting like wildfire. Marcus saw it in his eyes and laughed bitterly. "There it is, the real you. Violence is all you've ever known." Elias aimed square at Marcus's chest. "No, this isn't violence. This is justice." Marcus's smirk faltered. Before Elias could fire, more men stormed through the smoke. Marcus had reinforcements, 5, maybe 6. They spread out, circling Elias like predators. Clara screamed, clutching the cubs tighter, blood soaking her sleeve. Elias backed toward her, shielding them with his body. His rifle clicked empty. He drew his knife, his chest heaving. This was no longer just a fight. It was Elias standing as the last wall between innocence and annihilation. The men closed in. Elias fought like a cornered wolf, knife flashing, fist slamming, his body moving on instinct alone. One man went down, then another, but the rest overwhelmed him. Boots crushed him into the snow, fists rained down, rifles pressed to his skull. Marcus stepped forward, blood dripping from his own wounds. His smile twisted. "It's over, Ward." Elias spat blood, his voice hoarse. Not until one of us is gone." Marcus lifted his pistol, pressing it to Elias's forehead. The cubs whimpered. Clara sobbed. The fire roared behind them, throwing sparks into the night. For a moment the world slowed. Elias stared into Marcus's eyes and saw not a stranger, but the shadow of the brother he once loved. A boy who had laughed beside him, in boot camp. A soldier who had once dragged him from death, and then he saw the monster Marcus had become. The trigger would decide everything. But destiny had other plans. Before Marcus could fire, a deafening howl split the night. Every head turned. From the tree line emerged a massive grizzly, scars across its body, eyes blazing with fury. It was the mother bear they thought long dead. She had come for her cubs. The battlefield erupted in chaos. Marcus's men panicked, firing wildly at the beast. The bear charged, swiping one man aside like a rag doll. Another screamed as claws ripped through him. Elias seized the moment, slamming his knife into the leg of the man, pinning him down. He grabbed the fallen rifle, firing into the chaos. Marcus stumbled back, eyes wide, his perfect plan collapsing. In an instant, Elias rose, bloodied and trembling, standing between the bear and the cubs. For the first time he realized they weren't just fighting with him. They were fighting for him and Marcus. He was no longer the hunter. He was prey. The forest trembled beneath the roar of the grizzly. Flames flickered against her scarred hide, illuminating the rage in her eyes. The cubs whimpered, their tiny voices calling to her, and something primal surged through the clearing. Marcus's men froze, fear etched into their faces. The bravado of rifles and numbers meant nothing when confronted with nature's fury. One man screamed as the bear barreled into him, claws tearing through flesh like paper. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the firelight. Elias staggered to his feet, rifle in hand, eyes darting between the bear and Marcus's men. Chaos had erupted, and for the first time, he wasn't the only wall between death and the cubs. The balance of power had shifted. The cubs weren't defenseless anymore. Their mother had come back from the grave. Marcus shouted orders, but his men were too panicked to listen. One fired blindly, bullets sparking off trees. Another tried to run, only to be caught by the bear's massive jaws. His scream cut short in a spray of red. Clara pulled the cubs close, tears streaking her smoke-stained face. She looked at Elias with wide, desperate eyes. "Is this real? She's alive." Elias's throat tightened. She never stopped fighting. The grizzly roared again, charging at the next man. He raised his rifle, but Elias shot him down before he could fire. The man crumpled, lifeless. The bear didn't pause, her massive paw slamming into another soldier, sending him flying into the flames. The clearing became a nightmare of screams, smoke, and fury. Marcus, however, didn't retreat. His eyes burned, fixed on Elias. "You think this changes anything?" Marcus bellowed over the chaos. "Animals don't win wars. Men do." Elias aimed squarely at him. "Then why are your men running?" For the first time, Marcus's smirk faltered. He glanced at the fire, at the corpses littering the snow, at the grizzly standing protectively between Elias and the cubs. His army was crumbling, but Marcus wasn't a man who knew how to lose, and Elias knew he'd rather burn the whole forest than walk away defeated. Marcus raised his pistol, firing at the bear. The shot struck her shoulder. She roared in pain, stumbling back but not falling. "No!" Clara screamed. The cubs cried out, pouring toward their mother. Elias's heart pounded as he fired at Marcus, but the shot grazed his arm instead of hitting its mark. The bear charged again despite her wound. Marcus dove aside, his pistol flying from his hand into the snow. He scrambled up, blood seeping from his arm, his eyes wild. Elias advanced, rifle steady. "It's over, Marcus." Marcus laughed bitterly, blood staining his teeth. "You don't get it, Ward. It'll never be over. Not until you're in the ground." The grizzly growled, towering over them both. The fire raged behind her, casting monstrous shadows across the snow. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. The moment had come. Would Elias pull the trigger, or would the bear deliver nature's justice first? Either way, Marcus's reckoning had arrived. The clearing burned with the fury of man and beast. Elias stood steady, rifle aimed at Marcus. The grizzly circled, her growls vibrating through the ground, her blood dripping but her spirit unbroken. Marcus raised his hands slowly, eyes flickering between Elias and the bear. For the first time, Elias saw something he'd never expected. In his old brother's face, fear. "You kill me," Marcus spat, "and you become just like me. Another murderer in the snow." Elias shook his head, his voice low and steady. "No, the difference is I don't kill for greed. I kill for the ones who can't fight back," Marcus sneered. "You really think the world cares about your noble nonsense? You'll die out here, Ward. Forgotten, frozen, just like them." He gestured at the cubs. Elias's jaw clenched. He didn't lower the rifle. This was no longer just a fight. It was the moment Elias had to choose between vengeance and justice. The bear roared, lunging forward. Marcus dove for his pistol in the snow, rolling just in time. He fired a shot into the bear's chest. She stumbled, growling in agony, but still advanced. "Stay down," Elias roared, unleashing a shot that struck Marcus's leg. Marcus screamed, collapsing onto the blood-soaked snow. The bear loomed over him, her massive form casting a shadow, darker than the flames. Marcus raised his pistol again, but before he could pull the trigger, Elias's rifle cracked. The bullet tore through Marcus's hand, sending the pistol spinning into the snow. He howled in pain, clutching the mangled flesh. Elias stepped closer, his face stone. "You had a choice, Marcus. You chose betrayal. You chose blood." Marcus glared up, tears mixing with blood on his cheeks. "We were brothers." Elias's voice broke just for a moment. "We were." And with those words, the weight of years, their brotherhood, their battles, their betrayal, came crashing down in the firelight. The bear reared up, her shadow stretching across Marcus's broken body. With a roar that shook the forest, she brought her claws down. Marcus's scream was cut short. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames and the cubs' cries. Elias lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Clara clutched the cubs, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. The grizzly turned, blood streaming from her wounds, and nudged her cubs with her nose. They rushed to her, their tiny bodies pressing against her massive frame. She stood tall, defiant, even in pain. Elias dropped to his knees, exhaustion crushing him. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's over." But Clara touched his shoulder, her voice trembling. "No, Elias, it's not over. Not until you forgive yourself." The words struck him harder than any bullet, because deep down, he knew Marcus's death hadn't ended his war. The battlefield still lived inside him. The flames may have consumed Marcus, but could Elias ever escape the fire within his own soul? The forest was a graveyard of fire and silence. Smoke coiled up from the charred trees, carrying with it the scent of ash, blood, and betrayal. The storm had passed, but Elias felt no peace. He stood over the smoldering remains of Marcus, his own brother, the boy he once shared laughter and secrets with. The boy who had turned into a monster. The grizzly, bloodied yet unbroken, licked at her cubs with slow, trembling motions. They pressed into her, crying softly, as though begging her not to leave them again. Clara crouched nearby, stroking the smallest cub with hands that trembled like fragile leaves in the wind. Elias staggered back, rifle hanging limp in his hand. His body was alive, but his spirit felt hollow. Every breath was a reminder of the war still raging inside him. This wasn't a victory, but a scar that would never fade. Clara's voice broke through the heavy silence. "You saved them." "Elias, you saved her." Elias shook his head slowly. "I didn't save anyone, not really. The cubs lost their innocence. Their mother almost lost her life. And I..." His voice cracked. "I lost my brother again." He sank to his knees, the rifle slipping into the snow. The firelight reflected in his eyes, making it look as though the flames had climbed into his soul. The grizzly growled low, almost mournful. She limped toward Elias, her cubs following. For a moment he thought she might attack, but instead she stopped just short of him, her massive head lowering. Her breath fogged the cold air between them. Elias raised his hand, hesitating, then rested it gently against her scarred muzzle. Her eyes met his, and for that fleeting second, predator and soldier Beast and man shared the same pain. This wasn't about man versus nature anymore. It was about two survivors, scarred by betrayal, finding a fragile thread of understanding. Clara whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "She forgives you." Elias closed his eyes. Forgiveness. The one thing Marcus never gave him. The one thing he'd never given himself. The cubs nuzzled against their mother, and Elias felt tears burning down his cheeks. He wiped them away roughly, ashamed of his weakness, but Clara touched his arm softly. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," she said. "Not against the forest. Not against yourself." The words cracked something deep inside Elias. For so long he had been a fortress, walls built high against grief and guilt. But Clara's words, the bear's silent acceptance, the cubs' fragile cries, they were breaking those walls piece by piece. He looked around at the destruction, at the ashes where Marcus's ambition had burned out, and he whispered into the night, voice barely audible, "Maybe it really is over." But even as the flames dimmed, Elias knew survival was never the end. It was only the beginning of something harder. Healing. The question remained, could Elias learn to forgive himself before the scars of the past consumed him forever? The first rays of morning cut through the smoke, painting the forest in gold. Snowflakes drifted gently from the grey sky, covering the blackened earth like a shroud. The fire had died, but the scars of the night remained. Elias sat on a fallen log, rifle across his knees, staring into the horizon. His face was lined with exhaustion, but for the first time in years there was something else there, something like peace. The grizzly lay a short distance away, her cubs nestled against her belly. She was weak, but alive, her massive chest rising and falling with stubborn defiance. Clara knelt beside her, humming softly as if her voice alone could stitch the forest back together. Elias spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I thought I came here to protect them. Maybe they were protecting me." Clara looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "They gave you something you'd forgotten, Elias. A reason to fight that wasn't just about survival." Elias nodded slowly. She was right. Every battle with Marcus, every sleepless night, every scar, he had fought because he didn't know how to stop. But the cubs, they reminded him why he had once fought in the first place. For life, for innocence, for hope. The war had ended, but the journey of the soul had only just begun. The cubs stumbled clumsily in the snow, their tiny paws leaving trails that would soon be covered by fresh flakes. Elias smiled faintly. "They'll make it, they're stronger than they look." Clara leaned closer. "So are you." Elias turned to her, the weight of her words sinking in. For so long, he had been nothing but a shadow, a soldier without a war. But maybe, just maybe, he could be more. The grizzly raised her head, eyes locking on Elias. She huffed once, as though acknowledging him, before resting her head back down. It wasn't gratitude exactly, it was respect. Elias stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He looked at the cubs one last time, then at Clara. "It's time to leave this place, time to start again." Clara smiled, brushing soot from her cheeks. "Together?" He hesitated only a moment, then nodded. "Together." And just like that, the man who had walked into the forest carrying ghosts walked out carrying something far greater, hope. As they began their slow trek out of the clearing, snow falling around them like quiet blessings, Elias looked back one last time. The bear and her cubs were already fading into the white, becoming part of the forest's eternal story. And in that moment, Elias understood. Life wasn't about erasing scars. It was about learning to carry them without letting them define who you were. The forest sighed in the wind, almost as if it agreed. Elias whispered, voice steady now, "Goodbye, Marcus. Goodbye, ghosts." The dawn stretched ahead, brighter than it had ever seemed before, and that is where our story ends. A soldier scarred by betrayal, a family of bears saved from death, and a man who found forgiveness not in war, but in the innocence of life itself. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of the strength of compassion. If you were in Elias's shoes, betrayed by someone you loved, would you be able to forgive, or would you carry that anger forever? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading every single one,